This is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2022 virtual meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. My name is Adriana Chavez, and I will be talking to you about this research project entitled Principal Component Exploration of Individual Differences in the General Speed Component of Response Times. Throughout this presentation, we will be navigating through the following main arguments. First, we start a discussion by pointing out that different scores, the dependent measure typically used to study cognitive control, show weak correlations across tasks and poor test-retest reliability. Then, we present evidence that across many datasets, the general speed component of response times, that is, the mean response time observed across all trials, has a unifactorial solution. Even more, we present evidence that this unifactorial solution seems to be even stronger than that found in anthropometric data. Altogether, this seems to suggest that the different scores computed by Dunder's subtraction method might be inadvertently washing out the variance of interest in the data, so that there might be more future in research focused on this general speed component rather than in different scores. Let us now begin. Cognitive control is often defined as the ability to ignore irrelevant information and or to suppress a competing response in order to successfully complete a task. A classical example can be found on the Stroop effect. In a standard Stroop task, participants are presented with color names and asked to name the color of the word shown to them on screen every time. The completion of this task requires participants to suppress the information coming from the meaning of the word and respond solely based on the color of the stimuli. To quantify cognitive control, this type of tasks often rely on Dunder's subtraction method, which is based on the notion that individual mental processes can be isolated by subtracting the response times observed across different conditions that either require or don't this particular mental process. So, going back to our Stroop example, this task is usually conformed by two types of trials. First, a congruent condition where the color and the meaning of the word match, and then an incongruent condition where they don't. Following Dunder's subtraction method, we then isolate cognitive control in this task by taking the difference between the mean response time observed in the incongruent condition, which is the one for which we expect to observe larger response times, and the congruent condition. These different scores are then used to quantify participants' performance in cognitive control tasks. One might immediately note that the Stroop task is not something that we could assume to be inherently challenging on its own. This is why we are typically not interested in the accuracy observed in this type of tasks, as it is not considered to carry any meaningful information. Rather, our emphasis is merely placed on the difference observed across response times. And thus, it is often the case that this type of task also imposes some kind of time constraint to the participant's response. And although the Stroop task might be one of the most popular tasks used to study cognitive control in the literature, it is by far not the only one. There's a wide range of cognitive control tasks constantly being used and reported in the literature, the majority of which also rely on the same kind of general structure, where there is a contrast being made between a congruent and an incongruent condition. So, the existence of multiple cognitive control tasks being constantly used and reported in the literature facilitates the exploration of individual differences in cognitive control. What can we learn about one person's cognitive control from the different scores observed? Or, in other words, if I have observed the performance of any given participant on task A, would I be able to predict their performance on task B? What is the overall structure of cognitive control? Let us now continue with a description of what we have found by reanalyzing a few large-scale datasets. In the literature, one can find several studies where batteries of different cognitive control tasks are applied to participants to respond to specific research questions. One of such studies is that published by Reimermet and collaborators in 2018. This study included about 263 participants, all of who participated in the following 10 different cognitive control tasks, each of which consisted on something between 144 and 360 trials. So, for each of these 10 different tasks, we compute the different scores obtained per participant and find that the correlation between these individual different score tasks computed across tasks is rather poor, with a mean absolute correlation of 0.088. What we have on screen right now is the corresponding correlation matrix. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given these low correlations, if we run a principal component analysis on these different scores, we can't really identify any factor that could be carrying a notable proportion of the variance in this data. The script plot shown on screen presents the allocation of the proportion of variance across the different factors that could be identified by the principal component analysis. Here we can see that the first factor, which is by definition identified to be the one that accounts for the biggest proportion of the variance, accounts for barely 31% more variance than that accounted for in the second factor. And similarly, the ratio between the variance accounted for each of the remaining factors and the next one is smaller. We revisited a total of 9 different datasets collected across 5 different studies where multiple cognitive control tasks were applied. In this table, we show the number of tasks included in our revision, which might differ from the number of tasks reported in these studies originally because we focused only on cognitive control tasks that use different scores as their main dependent measure. We also show here the number of participants and the range of trials per task included in these studies. These numbers might vary from the original publications given our data cleaning steps. Under the assumption that you can pause the video at any point, to ensure that you have enough time to read through this table, I will continue with the presentation. So here, in the same order as listed in the previous table, we have a grid presenting the correlation matrix computed across task-specific different scores on each of these 9 different datasets revisited. In general, we can identify a consistent finding across all of them. Different scores correlate poorly across tasks. Now, if we take a look at the scree plots computed for each of these datasets, we once again find that the variance in our dataset seems to be closely allocated across all factors. In other words, there's not really a clear subset of factors that accounts for the majority of the variance, but rather the variance seems to be almost evenly allocated across all of the factors identified in each dataset. Now, let us talk about the general speed component of response times. Here we have a nice little graph that I borrowed from Router, Kummer, and Half because I find it to be particularly useful for the segue I want to build. So let's say that we decide to model the response times observed in congruent trials as random samples from a distribution center at the general speed of the participant. That is just in general how quickly or how slowly they respond to these type of tasks. And therefore, we can now think as the response times observed in congruent trials as samples from a similar distribution center at this general speed plus some effect that is going to capture in general how much time it takes to exert this cognitive control. It seems natural to expect this effect to be slightly different across tasks. So if we wanted to simulate data across 2 tasks, we could start by establishing 2 different arbitrary true effects per task for each participant. Here, the graph on the left is showing the correlation between the known set of true effects that we are going to be using in these simulations. As we can see, these true effects that we are currently using have a correlation of 0.78. Now, say that we use these true effects into a simulation study to generate trial-by-trial response times to be observed across the congruent and the incongruent conditions, as prescribed by our model. Note that in doing this, we have now introduced some trial-by-trial noise that ultimately gets ignored when we simply compute the mean response times across each condition and subtract them to infer the observed effect on each task. This is what we have on the graph on the right, the observed correlation between the actual differences that I calculated from this simulated data between the mean response time across the incongruent and the congruent condition. The correlation is now strongly attenuated. This might occur because by applying Dunder's method, we are inadvertently getting rid of the more substantial part of the variance in our data. So let us take one step back and focus on the general speed component that is present across the whole task. To do that, we compute the mean response time observed across all the tasks and data sets previously discussed and repeat our analysis. Here we have the correlation matrix for the data we had previously presented, collected by Ray Mermet and colleagues. As we can see, the correlation between the mean response times observed across tasks is now much stronger, with a mean absolute correlation of 0.65 that contrasts pretty nicely with the previous mean absolute correlation of 0.088. Furthermore, we can apply again a principal component analysis to this general speed component and find a much stronger evidence for a unifactorial evidence. As we can see here, the first factor now seems to account for 9 times more variance than the second factor. Once again, these results seem to hold across the remaining of the datasets revisited. The correlations between the mean response times observed across tasks seem to be much stronger. And so does the evidence found for a unifactorial structure. It is always the case that the first factor accounts for at least 3 times more variance than the second factor. Here we use an anthropometric dataset collected by the US Army that contains information for 93 different directly measured dimensions such as length, width, circumference, height, etc. across 6,068 participants, 4,082 of which were identified as men. Here we have the full correlation matrix across all 93 measures and all participants included in this study. As we can see here, the mean absolute correlation was found to be 0.52. If we plug this data into a principal component analysis, instead of finding a unifactorial structure, it is now the case that the majority of the variance could be attributed to the first two factors identified by our PCA analysis. In this case, the first factor seems to be explaining for 4.4 times more variance than the second factor, but the second factor is also explaining for 2.4 times more variance than the third factor. After further inspections of the measures that had the biggest factor loadings into each of these two factors, we could identify two main components to the anthropometric information. The first had to do with the size or stature, and the second had to do with the body build or grid. It is relevant to note that this two-factorial solution also seems to hold when we take a look independently at people that were identified as men versus people that were identified as females. So what we have here on screen now is the corresponding correlation matrix for participants that were identified as men, with a mean absolute correlation of 0.41, and the corresponding script plot, which again seems to be showing strong evidence for a two-factorial solution. Similarly, for participants identified as females, we have here the correlation matrix with a mean absolute correlation of 0.408 and a similar script plot showing that the majority of the proportion of variance in this dataset can be allocated across the first two factors. It could be argued that there are some redundancies across all 93 measures that could be influencing our results. But this two-factorial solution can still be found even if we take a look at different subsets of this anthropometric data. So for example, if we focus our attention on the following 5 different hand-related metrics, which seem to be strongly correlated across each other, as shown here in the following correlation matrix, that uses a similar color palette as that used previously when describing anthropometric data. Once again, if we apply a principal component analysis over these 5 different hand measures, we again find evidence for a two-factorial solution. Again, if we take a look at the factor loadings of these 5 different hand-related measures across these 2 different dimensions, we can once again identify the 2 components previously described. Interestingly, if we focus on a different subset of this anthropometric data, say for example head-related metrics, which I might dare to say shows a similar correlation patterns as those shown before, with a mean absolute correlation of 0.47, we now find that when looking at the script plot obtained when conducting a principal component analysis for these head-related measures, we seem to find yet again another case of a unifactorial solution where the first factor carries 4 times 8 more variance than the second factor, but the ratios between the proportion of variance accounted for by further factors does not seem to be as notable. Summary and conclusions. Throughout this presentation, we have talked about the fact that different scores computed across different cognitive control tasks show weak correlations. We also briefly discussed that this might be because the different scores wash away the trial-by-trial variance. We presented evidence that the general speed observed across cognitive control tasks show much stronger correlations and a robust unifactorial solution, while using some anthropometric dataset as a reference point. Altogether, this seems to be suggesting that further inspection of the general speed component might be necessary, and in fact, it plays a central role on the research that's been currently conducted at the lab. As we are now working on a project where we try to track back this unifactorial solution of the general speed component of response times back to the shift scale and rate parameters of different distributions often used to model response times. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the presentations.